Cool, cool. We are back for another interview. I have the privilege of interviewing the author of Inside the Criminal Mind. I had the privilege of reading that on my Kindle device, and I'm excited to be able to learn more about the book and be able to ask more questions related to this topic. How are you doing today, sir?
Oh, I'm doing fine, thank you. And you?
I'm doing well. The weather's getting a little better, but you know how, I don't know if you've ever been to Dallas, Texas, but the weather can be a little unpredictable at times.
I have been to Dallas, and I know it's very much like where I am near Washington, D.C. It can change in a heartbeat.
Well, hopefully the Wi-Fi connection keeps up so we can continue doing this interview. But before we do a deep dive into your book, I am interested in understanding terminology a little bit. When you, in the title, Inside the Criminal Mind, when you say the word criminal, are you referring to anyone that has broken the law, or are you referring to a certain type of individual?
Yeah, it's much broader than the law because you could be a criminal in Texas today, but if the laws change, even though you're the same person, you might not be a criminal tomorrow. So my use of the term criminal is much broader than particular laws of a society at a given time. It really is about human nature, how people live their lives. And there are people who would be criminals, in quotes, no matter where you put them. The man who said to me, well, doctor, if rape were legalized today, I wouldn't rape, but I might do something else. Because for a person like this, for him to be somebody in life, it's to do whatever is forbidden or exciting, to build himself up at the expense of others. And this sort of person leaves a trail behind him of physical or emotional or financial damage. So we're really talking about how people live their lives. And there is, of course, a spectrum, and I'm sure we can get into that. The book is written from the perspective of people who think a certain way, and they do so to an extreme, and the result is that they live a life where there is a trail of carnage behind them.
And when you say someone who leaves damage behind them, is that from the perspective of the rest of the world, or is that from the perspective of just the victims?
Oh, good question. Well, certainly from the perspective of the victim, but victims are direct and indirect. And so it's again like the stone in the pond and ripples spread out of injury. So let's say, and I'm thinking of one particular person that held up a restaurant that he used to work at. And he burst into the restaurant late at night, brandishing a gun. And he made off with the cash that they were counting up to take to the bank for the night depository. Well, as he said to me when I saw him in jail, he said, oh, well, there were no broken bones, there was no blood, nobody got shot, no one was hurt. But of course, what he wasn't taking into account was that the woman at whom he pointed the gun, life would never be the same for her again, because here she was in a place that she went to every day where she felt safe, and she had her life threatened. But it wasn't just her, but her family, her friends, people in the neighborhood who had other businesses. So there was a whole web of people that were affected by his one act. And of course, from his standpoint, because he's not putting himself in place of others, he was just doing what he did, and there was no physical injury. So I'm talking about damage, to answer your question, from the standpoint of the immediate victim, indirect victims, and the toll on society at large, because of course, this restaurant, more than likely, after being robbed, would have to spend more money for greater security. People who work there would never feel the same security again, and it goes on from there.
And have you found that a view of crime changes between countries and culture, or is there a universal understanding of what crime and crime and criminals are?
You know, I think that there is agreement, really, because stealing, murdering, raping, break and entry, these are crimes, no matter where you are. Now, laws differ. So we're back to the mind. And that is the critical issue. Where I think cultures and countries differ is in their theorizing about causes of crime. But I think there's pretty much a consensus. Injury is injury. You know, whether somebody has been physically damaged, whether somebody has had resources taken from them, or whether they've been betrayed and hurt and controlled emotionally. I don't think that's peculiar to a particular culture.
You mentioned causes of crime. I think it's a good opportunity to transition into your first chapter where you talk about the environment does not cause crime. Could you kind of explain that a little bit?
Sure. So almost everything but the federal debt has been targeted as a cause of criminal behavior. I mean, it goes on and on. Poverty, affluence, child abuse, overindulgence as a child, the media and violence depicted on the media, cycles of the moon, a lack of certain elements in one's diet. It goes on and on and on. And what I have found, and this is not where I started, because I believed all of that when I first began in this work a long time ago, is that what is critically important, it is not the environment, but it is how people choose to deal with whatever life hands them. So just to give you one quick example, it's practically universally believed that poverty causes crime. But the fact is, most poor people are not criminals. Many well-to-do ones are. And what may be a, quote, risk factor for one person is an opportunity factor for another. And by that, what I mean is that the environment affects us. There's no doubt about it. I mean, if you are living in a neighborhood that is gang-ridden and your family is unstable and drugs are sold at the corner and firearms are as easy to come by as candy bars, of course, that's going to be a difficult environment to grow up in, to say the least. And there are going to be many, many severe challenges to deal with. However, what I have found repeatedly is, and I have interviewed people, plenty of them, who have come from those environments. And in almost every case, the offender has had a brother, sister, maybe more than one, who grew up in the same poverty, in the same difficult circumstances, but they made different choices. Called causes of crime really don't stand up. None of them is necessary or sufficient to explain why. So what I did is said, okay, if we don't know why, let's look at the person we're dealing with. And the shift was from why to what kind of thinking gives rise to criminal behavior. It's like a scratch on the table. You don't have to know why the table was scratched, how it got to be that way, but you do need to know what the table is made up of so you can decide what to do with the table. The analogy here being that the focus became thinking because behavior is a product of thinking. And even in Proverbs, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he.
And I'm sure you've talked to many developmental psychologists when it comes, them studying kids who grew up in those environments. what are your thoughts on a kid developing PTSD from the chronic stress of being in those environments? Are you saying that the environment does have some influence, but they ultimately choose the life they want to live, or?
Thank you for helping me clarify that. So, yes, of course, kids do get abused, obviously through no fault of their own. They are victims. There are people who are traumatized by their early abuse and mistreatment. So the environment has an effect. The question is, what is the difference between a person who has been traumatized and struggles to overcome what he's been through? A person who is resilient. I'm not saying there's not an aftermath, but he still makes choices as to how he's going to live. So yes, the environment can have all kinds of influences, but it's the individual who ultimately makes choices over time. There are innumerable veterans who suffer from PTSD from their deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq and other trouble spots on the globe. And they return to civilian life, and there's a high incidence of trauma, and that takes many forms in their behavior and their thinking, but most of them do not use drugs. Most of them do not murder somebody. They have their struggles to adjust to life, and that horrible environment they were in has an impact, but they're not criminals.
And me being a psychology major, we of course learned about the Stanford prison experiment. What are your thoughts on the Stanford prison experiment? My impression of the experiment was that if you put a label on somebody, or if you put them in a certain environment, it will obviously influence them a certain way, especially when it comes to learned helplessness. What are your thoughts on learned helplessness in a certain environment when it comes to that?
Well, again, that phenomenon has been documented. It does exist, but think about people who have been in horrendous situations where they actually have been POWs, or where they have had to live in terrible circumstances. People like Elizabeth Smart, who was abducted and just experienced some of the most horrible things. And look at the life that Elizabeth Smart has been and still is building. So I'm sure that she had, well, I know she had treatment. I've read that. I don't know any more than anybody else does, but she's had treatment. I'm sure she has needed it. What happened to her, she cannot erase, but despite what happened to her, she is going to have to work very hard, and she is, from what I've read, to build a life. So while she was a captive of the people who abducted her, a lot of things occurred, but look at the ultimate outcome. And who is this person now?
In chapter 2, you talk about how parents don't turn children into criminals. Is there a fear that parents will not take ownership of their parenting, or kind of take them off the hook when it comes to their parenting because of that chapter?
It's a great question. And in fact, I have been criticized for that Samenow lets parents off the hook. That, oh, well, it doesn't matter what parents do. It's these bad, rotten kids, and it's blame the kids and not the parents. So, great question, and let me respond. So it isn't about blame and fault, first of all. And parents have, at least I am a parent, a grandparent, so parents have an awesome responsibility, and that is to bring up their kids to be decent, moral people who hopefully can make their way honorably and independently and use the talents they have. I mean, that's the job of a parent. And there are parents who are terrible. There are parents who are themselves criminals. And there are parents who are not criminals, but who just aren't very good at the job of parenting. So, and that does have an impact. You read about helicopter parents, parents who hover and micromanage or attempt to micromanage whatever their kids do. So speak of learned helplessness, they don't do things for themselves that they really could do because there's a parent there to always pick up the pieces or tell them what to do. So yeah, that kind of parent has an impact. Of course, the question then is when the child gets older and physically and more psychologically free of that parent, not all kids are helpless. They do make their own way. But yeah, parents have an impact. But what I'm saying is that I have interviewed, this is not an exaggeration because I've been doing this work for 40 years more, that in many cases, not all, but I've interviewed parents in depth who have struggled to be the best parents they can be. And they have more than one child. And they will tell me, I don't know what it is about this one kid. He was different, could be a she, I'm using he, from almost from the time that he was in diapers. My other kids, you know, they kind of did what you asked them to do. I mean, they weren't perfect, but they grew up. If they said they were going to be one place, they were there. If they had homework, they didn't love homework, but I mean, they did it. The kids they hung out with were good. They brought them home. I knew who they were. But you know, this one kid, Michael, he was always irritable, whining, dissatisfied, always sneaking around, treating his brother in the cruelest, most sadistic manner. As he got older, I'd have to be careful and watch him all the time. Any family functions, he would disrupt. And when he got to school, it got worse and worse. I'd get calls from the school, the principal, and so it went. And there was nothing that I could find about this parent that caused or created this. And certainly if this parent was so horrible, it isn't too likely that the other two kids would have turned out to be responsible and well-behaved. So what I'm saying is, again, the environment does matter. Parents have a responsibility, but you can have a parent who does everything he can. And parents always make mistakes and they always think of things they could have done differently, should have done, shouldn't have done. But I mean, I've seen parents who take their kids to counselors from an early age, who seek help themselves, and nothing that they do seems to make a significant difference for very long. And sometimes it takes something really serious happening, not under their own control, but something on the outside where the kid is apprehended for something or gets into serious trouble because he won't listen to anybody. He rejects his parents, he rejects school, he rejects responsible peers. Rather than being rejected by them, he's the one that does the rejecting. So parents have a job to do. They need to do the best they can. And, but that doesn't guarantee a good outcome. And in fact, there is a book that was written years ago by a professor at the University of Texas, David Cohen, and it's called Stranger in the Nest. And it isn't about crime and criminals, but it's talking about how in a family you can have several children and one is so different. Well, the kids are all different from each other, of course, but one is so different and so that he's a stranger in the nest. It's like he's not even from this family. And that's despite the best efforts of parents.
And I'm sure people that are watching or listening to this interview, they're thinking, so are you saying that not everyone, like there are some people that are so far gone that there isn't any hope for them? Or I don't know if this kind of goes into chapter 12 of mental illness and criminal psychology, just kind of like your thoughts about that. Are some people just born helpless because they're just so far gone, or?
No, that's a very well-timed question for what we're talking about. People hearing me talk might say, oh, well, he thinks they're born this way. But I don't know that. Remember, I said earlier that the causal question, it's still a question. I mean, there are a lot of things we don't know the cause or causes of. You know, there's a lot about the coronavirus that we don't know. There's a lot about certain forms of cancer, but it doesn't mean that we don't try to detect it early, doesn't mean that we don't try to treat it. So the analogy here is that I don't know if people are born this way, but even if there were a predisposition in some genetic or biological manner, biology is not necessarily destiny. So in some families, and this has been pretty well documented, there is a predisposition to become an alcoholic. Well, if you know that's true, then all the more reason to choose not to drink. Or we'll take something way far afield, prostate cancer. We don't know a great, I mean, there's a lot we do know, but there's a lot we don't know. But if you know that there's a predisposition in your family, and it does tend to run in families, then there are certain things you might try to do that are preventive. A lot having to do with diet, a lot having to do with early screening. So you would still try to do something preventive. And if the disease, I'm now talking about prostate cancer, if you were to get it, you would get it early and be able to treat it early. Now, I'm not calling criminality a disease, but in answer to your question, that and these patterns often do begin early. Not, you don't see them in all cases early, but in some cases you do. So even if there were a predisposition, still behavior is a product of thinking, and one can change one's thinking if motivated. Of course, that's a whole other issue. So I am a psychologist, and as a psychologist, my I'll use the word mission, maybe that's a little strong, but I don't think so. It's to try to help people change and to live productive, moral lives in which, again, I'm repeating myself, they use the talents and abilities that they have for their own benefit and for the benefit of others. And there are many, many ways one can do that. So I am not saying that any child should be thrown away at all. In fact, I wrote another book called Before It's Too Late, and it's about trying to identify some of these patterns of thinking, and I emphasize the word patterns, early. So in some cases, to try to intervene and to take some preventive steps, just like we do with learning disabilities, physical problems, emotional problems. So no, I'm not for discarding or giving up on any child.
You mentioned about motivating somebody's thinking. There's, obviously there's thoughts out there how prison can motivate someone's thinking to change their life. What are your thoughts on our current prison system? Is jail the best wake-up call for criminals, or is there another way?
Well, it's a big question, and it's an important one. So certainly incarcerating somebody is a last step, but for some people, you hear this phrase, this is in treating alcohol and drug problems, about a person reaching rock bottom. Now, what is rock bottom for one person may not be for another. So the thing about jail, I'm talking now about community facilities, that for some people, and this could be true of juvenile detention centers, whereas there's certainly not a cure or a remedy, but in some cases, it takes that to get someone's attention. When all other possibilities have been exhausted, parents trying to help their kids, counseling if it's been tried and it fails, probation hasn't worked, attempts to work with a person in the community hasn't worked, or if the crime is a very violent crime, of course. Incarceration does accomplish incapacitation, but for some people, it is a time where finally doing things their way has not worked. And these individuals know the occupational hazards of crime. They know they could get caught, convicted, confined, actually injured or killed in a high-risk crime. But when they commit crimes, they believe at the moment it's not going to happen to them. They have the ability to shut off fear of all those or any of those things happening. So they know the consequences, but they have the chilling capacity. It's like you could turn off a light switch just to shut that knowledge off. So when they end up behind bars, that which they knew might happen, or wasn't going to happen to them, now has happened. And life is passing them by. They don't know what's going to happen in terms of the court. They don't know whether their families are going to continue to support them. And so possibly for some, not all, for some, it is a time where there is some vulnerability where they may be amenable to looking in the mirror. I mean, none of us wants to look in the mirror for very long at the negative aspects of our lives, but this is a time where doing things their way has failed. I mean, there are only three choices. They can continue as they have with inevitably worse consequences. They can change to a way of life that at times they've thought they wanted, maybe even envied, but then have found it too boring and dull, so they've rejected it, or not to live at all, which is a choice: suicide, crime, or change. So I have been to almost every jail in the Washington, D.C. metro area. Why? Not because I like to hang out around jails, but because when I get calls, it's from an attorney, or it's from a parent, or it might be from a probation officer if probation has been revoked, and I'm told or asked, will you see so-and-so now? He may be ready finally to talk about himself. He may realize that he's come to a crossroads. On the other hand, of course, all he may be interested in is trying to impress somebody and get his way out of a jam that he's created, but only time will tell. So I've gone to these jails and I've sat down with offenders, or at the time defendants, whatever, and spent hours at a time, no 45-minute dash in and dash out, and let them try to convince me they're good guys. But I've spent hours, if they are willing, to try to talk to them about who they are, how they've lived, what their options are, what their thinking is like. So incarceration can be a catalyst for change. Now, I know that there is a very, very strong move to help people get out of prison, that there are too many people locked up, and that there are people who could be maintained and supervised in the community, especially we have technology, GPS and so forth. And I think that's probably true. We have an awful lot of people locked up in this country. However, there are people who should be incarcerated. They have no inclination to change. They are as criminal in their behavior in prison as they are elsewhere. I mean, the criminal mind locked up is still the criminal mind. You have thefts, you have assaults, you have con games, all kinds of stuff that goes on in correctional facilities. And there are people who, without any remorse, who have committed violent crimes and who are going to reject anything that's offered. Then there is this other group, people who maybe could be maintained and worked within the community, but you've got to give them the resources. In the 1960s, they talked about community mental health, and they emptied the state hospitals. And the idea was that they would provide community mental health, medication, counseling, and so forth. Well, you see the result of that are hundreds of thousands of homeless people living under bridges, pitching tents on streets, and a massive homeless population. And these hospitals are shut, and community mental health was simply a nice idea. It was never funded. They never did it. So is the same thing going to happen with corrections, where these well-meaning people are saying, oh, we shouldn't have all these people locked up. We can work with them. We can give them job training. We can give them this, that, and the other in the community. And then they just start releasing people without the programs, without the funding, and without the screening and looking at who they're releasing. So my long answer to your question is that yes, reform in this area is important, but the rush to go from one extreme to the other, I'm very wary of.
And I have a couple questions to follow up. I think the first question I have is, when you go to see somebody that is in jail to, assess them, how do you know whether or not they're just telling you what you want to hear versus them being authentic and genuine about their answers?
Good question. The answer is I don't know, because when I am evaluating a defendant, there are two evaluations going on. He's evaluating me, and if he's heard about me before he even meets me, he's already done his homework. And of course, he's casing me out, as he does with everybody else when he's meeting me. And more than likely, he has an objective, depending on the situation. If the court has not yet made a sentencing decision, then he wants, understandably, this is not being critical, he wants the minimum sentence. So if he thinks that impressing somebody like me may help in his sentencing case, he will feed me what he thinks I want to hear and what I want to know. So the three most frequent words I use in working with offenders is time will tell. So sure, I can be fooled, I can be conned, it's happened, it will happen again. However, I would say two things. Number one, if you know how these individuals think, you are far less likely to be traveling down some unproductive road, asking them about their mother, their father, their bad breaks, giving them an arena to present themselves as victims. You can eliminate a lot of that by focusing on them, their choices. If their girlfriend left them and they got upset and they used drugs, well, how does he deal with other situations which don't go his way? Why did his girlfriend leave him? What was there about him that resulted in her doing that? So I'm always going to keep coming back to the person's own choices and responsibility. The other point is this. You notice I said that I would sit down for several hours initially. So I am going to interview a man who violated his probation in a rather serious way, and I am supposed to interview him by remote interview at the jail sometime in the next couple of weeks. Well, I already told his attorney that I needed to get any documents about his crimes, criminal record, pre-sentence report for the original offense, any mental health records, and that I would need to have, even to formulate a beginning impression, I'd have to read these documents, have at least two 2-hour interviews, because that's the maximum they allow by remote. So I'm not going to be a target for some quick snow job. So time tells the story. And look, if a person's objective is to do with me what he's done with so many other people, to control them, to fool them, to deceive them, to get his own way, well, time will tell the story, and it's his life. I mean, I'm not going to make any statements that I can read his mind. I can't, but I will look at patterns that unfold over time.
I want to go back to something you had said earlier about whenever a child or teenager goes to see a counselor, and this is like before they end up getting locked up and going down a really bad path. Do you feel like counselors are equipped to provide therapy and counseling for kids that are making a lot of bad decisions, that are in a really bad place? Is the reason why sometimes counseling doesn't work is because the counselors aren't equipped or trained enough in that area?
Well, at the risk of alienating some of my colleagues in the field, which I've probably already done by what I've written, the answer is very simple. I was completely fooled for years. I was not trained. I was not equipped to deal with this population. I thought, oh, it's got to be their parents, and maybe it was peer pressure, and, this, that, and the other. And so I was one of these people who counseled kids. So I had a kid who was a delinquent who had had counseling rather than a delinquent without counseling. He was still a delinquent. So most people, and I understand this, if you're seeing a 15-year-old kid who's kind of a one-man walking crime wave already, you think there's got to be something wrong with what's going on at the home. We got to do family therapy. We need to talk to these parents. We need to find out what his early experience is. Maybe he's not in the right program at school. You start looking at all these factors external to the individual, and this is going to be a total waste of time. So I do think that very few mental health professionals choose to work with this population, and when they get them, they often don't recognize them for what they are. And I remember long ago, a offender, this was an adult, who said that I used to think I had enough excuses for crime before therapy. Now I have more than enough after. So I think that a lot still has to be done to help well-intentioned, and I'm not maligning my profession, these are well-intentioned counselors who do want to help kids, but because they have been trained a certain way, and it's kind of endemic almost in our culture to see things as outside forces and the environment, and not to focus on the person himself. And again, it's not a matter of blame. It's a matter of saying, how can we best help? And the way to help is to focus on patterns of thought that give rise to this troublesome and troubling behavior. So you asked me whether cognitive behavioral therapy was the most effective approach. And I'm saying yes, but you've got to know what the thinking patterns are, because people who make crime a way of life, they really do think very differently from people who are basically responsible. Let me give you this example. So a man said, when I walk into a room, now he's speaking about a break and entry, everything in that room belongs to me. Now that sounds like a totally preposterous statement. And it's not a mental illness. I mean, he knows that the cash and the electronics and the jewelry in the house that he's broken into are not literally his. But if you understand this frame of reference, they are already his. He has this sense of ownership. He thinks it, thinking makes it so. So all he has to do is to figure out how to take possession of what is already his, make his getaway from the house that he's broken into, conceal the items, and then find a way to dispose of them. So this concept of ownership, this chessboard view of life, this is very different from the way most people operate who are responsible. These are people who pursue power and control for their own sake. So one man said, I made myself a little god into a little god at every turn, meaning that for him, the world was his chessboard. People and objects were for him to move around like pawns on a chessboard. To control other people elevated his opinion of himself. His self-esteem rose and fell depending on whether he could achieve power over others, use others for his own purposes, gain the advantage by stealth, intimidation, or violence. So you have to understand what the thinking patterns are to be able to work with cognitive therapy with this population.
And I guess we can transition into rehabilitation. In your opinion, what is the perfect rehab program from what you've seen over the years?
All right, I want to, I know this will sound like nitpicking maybe, take issue with the word rehabilitation.
Okay.
If you look it up in the dictionary, it means to restore someone to an earlier state or condition. You rehabilitate an old house in Dallas. You restore it to what it once was. You help rehabilitate a stroke victim, help her regain functions that she once had. There is nothing to which to rehabilitate many of the people that I'm speaking about because they never were responsible to begin with. So the scope of the task is broader than GED opportunities, work skills, social skills, that sort of thing. And those are fine. I am not attacking those programs at all. But if you have a criminal and you help him equip himself with job skills, you'll have a criminal with job skills rather than one without job skills. And he may use the very job skills he's earned or he's learned to gain entree into new arenas for crime. So I remember one particular person that actually learned to be a locksmith. He was very good and very smart and very capable. Well, you can imagine what he used that for. But I mean, there are many, many examples. So I'm all for programs that give people new skills, but sometimes it's like pouring a delectable sauce over rancid meat. Unless you're able to work with some of these basic thinking patterns I'm talking about, the lack of a concept of obligation, the failure to put yourself in the place of others, the lack of a responsible time perspective, because what you want now, the lack of responsible decision-making skills, where you don't need to get information and weigh alternatives because you think you already know it and you act on it. So an ideal program for change, and I would call it for habilitation, not rehabilitation, would include certainly helping a person with the skills he needs, whether it's money management or whatever, but it's also to help this person recognize what these thinking patterns are, how they show themselves, and what they have led to. And now I want to say this. The objective in working with this sort of person in the early phases is very different from working with many other client populations. So with many different types of problems, you want to help a person who is suffering from anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, and a variety of other problems. The thing with a criminal is, rather than comforting the afflicted, you have to afflict the comfortable, meaning that these are not people who are suffering from low self-esteem. Oh yes, it's true that we may see them at a time when they have failed, meaning they failed at crime. They are in situations, I mean, where do we encounter them? They're in situations they don't want to be in. They're in a counselor's office, that's somebody else's idea. They're in jail, not their idea, not where they want to be, in a juvenile detention center. So they're dissatisfied or depressed, if you will, more than likely about their situations, but not about themselves. And in fact, they may very well have contempt for the people around them, and their objective is to work their way out of their situation and there is no change in their view of themselves as number one, as in control, as the person who's going to make fools out of others. So we've got to talk to this person in, and I want to underscore this, in a calm, patient, and respectful manner about these patterns and how thinking the way they do, they have even hurt people that they say they care about. A mother who has given them chance after chance. Their kids, if they have kids, the impact on those kids of growing up without a father or with a father who's not around very much, or how they've let down their wives or their partners, and how these people who have stood by them, what they've done to them, to which you may say, well, you're saying put them on a guilt trip. But you know, guilt can be a very good thing. If I do something that is really harmful to somebody else and thoughtless, there's no way that I'm going to make amends, if it's possible, unless I do feel guilty. So guilt, and I remember years ago, there was a writer by the name of Willard Galen, I think he was a psychiatrist, who wrote, "Guilt is the guardian of our goodness." So what we want to do is to hold the mirror up to this person and say, look, again, in a respectful and calm manner, none of this in your face stuff or using four-letter words or calling him names or yelling at him or in your face, none of that. And talking to him about how he's lived his life, what these thinking patterns are, what they have resulted in, and eventually what they invariably will result in again, and even something maybe worse than the situation he's in now. Now, you can't persuade, entice, cajole, or seduce somebody into thinking differently. You can lay out the options. You can approach him or her at a time when maybe there's vulnerability, and this view of the self is number one, and as the person who is the victor in every situation, when that self-image maybe has taken a few blows because the situation he's in is unacceptable to him, and then you go in with, you know, there are three choices: to continue as you are, and it will be more of the same. Sure, maybe you'll get away with a lot you already have that you haven't been caught for, but inevitably you'll end up in a place like this or worse, or to change to a way of life that you've rejected so far, but which is doable, where you won't have to look over your shoulder for others who will hold you accountable, where people will start to trust you, where you will have a sense of feeling clean, but a life without guarantees of success. Or many of them have had the thought, it's better not to live at all. Although very few of these people actually commit suicide, they think about it, and the antidote to that thinking is, again, to go on the offensive. And their suicidal thinking is not that they're not good enough for this world, it's that the world isn't good enough for them. There is blazing anger in their thinking about suicide. And you've seen this, by the way, in some of these murder by cop crimes, where serial killers will start shooting, or mass killers will start shooting, and they will take their own lives before they will allow anybody to capture them, and where they'll have to submit to others. So, I mean, that's been played out, unfortunately, in some of these mass shootings. So, back to the question. Thinking is critical. Behavior is a product of thinking, and without, well, if I want to change something about myself, you know, maybe I'm too impatient, or maybe I should lose 10 pounds, whatever it is, to change my behavior, I have to become aware of the thinking that gives rise to what I want to change. What is the thinking where I'm starting to get annoyed or irritable because I'm having to wait for something? And then I have to catch the thinking, I have to interrupt it, I have to see it as poison, because what is it going to result in? It's going to result in hurting other people, not physically, but, you know, giving them a rough time. It's certainly not going to help me accomplish any objective. So for any of us to change anything about ourselves, thinking is vital, and we have to become aware of our own errors in thinking. So for people who make crime a way of life, they are impatient, and we're all impatient at times. So, I mean, it's not just criminals who are impatient, but there's a big difference between somebody who wants to cash a check in a bank and goes in and he's in a rush and there's a line and he gets annoyed and irritable and thinks that the teller is too slow. And a big difference between that and a person who, whenever the world does not accommodate him, then he gets angry, annoyed, starts putting down others, gets angry, irritable, forces his way to the front. I mean, that's a totally different mindset. So although we can all say we make errors in thinking, we lie at times, we're impatient, we're irritable, we sometimes try to control things we shouldn't control. For people who do these things and others as a way of life, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and you get this whole different view of life with the consequent injury to others that we've been talking about.
What is something, because I know the majority of kids that grow up in the United States, they spend a lot of time in the public school system growing up. What are some things that teachers can do and the school system can do to help with this process of teaching their students how to think differently?
Well, if you were a fourth grade teacher, and fourth grade is 9 years old or so, and if I gave you a list of some of these characteristics, kids who as a pattern, not once in a while, but a kid who routinely, to get his way, intimidates or bullies others, a kid who lies as a way of life, not just to get out of trouble, but lies to make fools out of others. The kid who's always seeking the easy way out, any means to an end. The kid who almost never accepts responsibility for what he does, but constantly blames others. So a teacher who spends 6 hours a day with these fourth graders would be able to recognize some, hopefully it's a small number, but some of these kids who show these patterns, and I emphasize the word patterns, that expand and intensify over time. So the question is whether or not, by being aware of these patterns, instead of making them worse, by sometimes the easiest thing is just to give way and let a kid get away with the easy thing, or it's to not, it's to be persuaded by their presenting themselves as victims without questioning their role in the situation that they're involved in. There are things that teachers can do. I mean, they can't be, if you have a classroom with 25 kids and you only have, well, even if you have 2 kids like this, they can create mayhem and interfere with the learning of all the others, but that's another issue. So you can, and that's why I wrote Before It's Too Late, because I talk about certain things that parents and teachers can do, first of all, to recognize these patterns and then try to address them in day-to-day situations. Having said that, there are, and I've said this many times, unfortunately, kids who are just not going to listen. They will turn a deaf ear to all of this, as they have to their parents, and though their teachers may conscientiously try to help them and change these patterns, it's going to take something a lot more serious than, say, being sent to the principal or having to stay in at recess to get their attention. But I think that there is more that can be done than is being done, because what often happens is people see these patterns and they say, well, you know, the kid has it rough at home, and, you know, he'll grow out of it, and it's just the stage. And so they kind of don't address it.
Awesome. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk about your book, Inside the Criminal Mind. If people have questions, or where can they contact you?
You may give them my email,
Okay.
which is samenow@cox.net. I have a website, and also I do write a blog for Psychology Today online, and I've been doing it for a long time. and it is called Inside the Criminal Mind. Probably the book, which is in paperback or available, as you said, on the Kindle, Inside the Criminal Mind, will answer a lot of questions. But certainly, if any of our listeners or viewers want to email me with a question, I will answer it.